Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. When this episode goes live 4 days from now, Donald Trump will have been sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, after having served as the 45th President from 2017 to 2021. Many countries around the world are closely watching to identify changes in U.S. policy and assess their impact. China is one of those countries. As presidential candidate, Trump threatened to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese goods imported into the United States. He also proposed revoking China's most favored nation trading status and banning China from buying U.S. farmland. He pledged to curtail Chinese espionage and theft of intellectual property. But on some occasions, Trump praised Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and he predicted they would get along very well. In the past few months, Trump and Xi have been in communication through their representatives. What approach will Beijing take toward Trump's presidency this time around? Is China in a stronger or weaker position than it was during Trump's first term? What is the likely trajectory of U.S.-China relations in the coming 4 years? To discuss these questions, I'm pleased to have as my guest today Dr. Evan Medeiros, who is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at the Georgetown University, and also Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in the U.S.-China Studies program there. He served 7 years in President Obama's National Security Council, first as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as special assistant to the president and senior director for Asia. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Evan.
Great to be here.
So I want to start by looking back a bit. What are the lessons that you think Beijing drew from its experience with Trump in his first term?
Bonnie, I think this is a really critical question because I think the Chinese in their assessments recently have come to several conclusions about lessons learned. Number one, personal relations with Donald Trump don't get you anywhere. They're reminded of their whiplash from the great state visit plus that they offered Trump in the fall of 2017, only to be followed by a very competitive set of policies in 2018. Second, a second lesson is watch what Trump does, not what he says. There's too many voices in a Trump administration. It's too hard to separate the wheat from the chaff. So just watch what they do. Don't try and understand the cacophony of voices in Washington. Number three, just expect and plan for volatility and unpredictability in both people and policymaking. In other words, you can reach a deal with Trump, but there's probably only a 50% chance that it's going to stick. Fourth, show the Trump team that you can cause them pain. The Chinese very much believe that's the only way you're really going to deter the United States. And fifth, Trump has surrounded himself with a bunch of ideologues on China. Whether you agree with it or not, that's a very firm conclusion in Beijing. And these people are ultimately focused on regime change and containment in China. And finally, one big lesson I think they've learned is that there is strategic opportunity in a Trump administration. He weakens alliances, he alienates much of the world, and that China needs to make sure that it doesn't squander the opportunity created by Trump like they did in his first term.
On the point of imposing pain on the United States, we'll get back to that maybe later in the podcast, but I think that's really an important point. China's put together its own toolkit now to retaliate, respond, and can do that now in ways that it really couldn't do during Trump 1.0. So you recently published an article in the Financial Times and argued that many Chinese see Xi Jinping as stronger politically than 8 years ago and assess China's economy as more self-reliant and resilient, and that they view the United States economy as more fragile. They view our politics as very polarized. But many Americans, I think, believe that the balance of power has in fact shifted in U.S. favor. Certainly the Biden administration officials have been saying that for some time, that the U.S. has pursued its own self-strengthening agenda through investments in the United States. And of course, invest, align, compete meant align closely with our allies. The relations with allies have been substantially strengthened. And the Biden administration has pursued this set of restrictions on tech transfer to China, especially in semiconductors. So China's economy is not where it was in 2017. They came out of COVID not really having the surge that they expected, and they are facing economic difficulties. Some people think they're growing at maybe 2-3%, and that they won't be able to exceed anything more than maybe 4 or 4.5%. I think that's Rhodium's projection going forward. So, I guess, do you agree with that analysis? Do you think that shift had took place or is taking place? And if so, does this provide the Trump team with leverage? And then how could they use it?
Well, first, let me clarify, Bonnie, that I believe it's the Chinese assessment. I don't necessarily agree with it, that Xi is stronger and the economy is more self-reliant and resilient. So I do think that this situation, this shift to relative Chinese economic weakness, provides the Trump administration with leverage, at least in the short term. The question is, how do they use it? And, the situation the Trump administration is walking into is one where China faces a series of immediate economic headwinds. And a big part of those economic challenges is the loss of confidence in China and outside of China. Investors say onshore and offshore about the future of the Chinese economy. And so a U.S.-China economic skirmish initiated by Trump actions in retaliation for Chinese actions, that would diminish confidence even further. And that would occur at a time of weakness in the renminbi, which the Chinese, the People's Bank of China already has to defend. So I think that the way the Chinese look at it is they say, well, over the long term, we're becoming a more resilient and self-reliant economy. But in the short term, we have some weaknesses, and those could be exploited. So we have to be very, very careful about that. So the question is, can the Trump administration leverage China's concern about its short-term economic trajectory to get what it wants? But of course, the big question is, and I'd welcome your views on this, what exactly is it that Trump wants? What is he going to be asking the Chinese to do?
Well, I think it remains to be seen whether Trump actually wants a trade deal, whether he wants to go back to the negotiating table, or whether he just wants to pursue decoupling. I think that was Bob Lighthizer preference if he had been in this administration, and perhaps that is what they will pursue. But Trump, of course, prides himself on being unpredictable and does not want to reveal his hand. And so to me, I'm still in the dark. I don't know exactly what his agenda would be. I think he doesn't want China to know what his real objective is. But of course, we'll see within the coming weeks what it is. China's likely to send a high-level delegation. I think the Vice President Han Zheng is going to lead that delegation, and I'm told that he will likely meet with his counterpart, with J.D. Vance, while he after the inauguration. So we might have a little bit more insights then, though I don't think we're going to have clarity. But if you think so, Trump, let's say one scenario, he proceeds right out of the gate with as high as 60% tariffs, or maybe somewhat lower. How do you think China would react?
Well, I think the Chinese are going to react pretty swiftly. And they have this whole new toolkit of economic weapons that they can use to retaliate. And it would be a combination of tariffs, controls on exports of technologies, critical minerals and materials the U.S. needs for its supply chains, investigations into American companies. I mean, if there's one lesson the Chinese learned from the first U.S.-China trade war under Trump 1, was that they didn't have the toolkit to respond. Because of the nature of the trade relationship, there's just limits on how many tariffs they're willing to impose on the United States. It's not in their interest to do so.
Are there ways that China can hurt the U.S. without really hurting itself?
I think so. I mean, I think, and we've already seen some examples of that. Right, the ways in which the Chinese can put limits on the exports of critical materials like germanium, gallium, graphite, antimony in ways that will frustrate American producers of semiconductors. They can disrupt the supply chain of drone companies like Skydio, who now has to completely rethink where they get their battery technology from. They've conducted investigations into Micron. They threatened one into NVIDIA. And I think just today, they've signaled that they're going to probably impose some penalties on the American apparel maker PVH in retaliation for the Biden administration's designation of multiple Chinese companies who are involved in production in Xinjiang. So I think given the nature of the trade relationship, there's actually quite a bit that the Chinese can do. I mean, their game plan is always to find maximum points of both economic and political pressure, right? So one of the first things they will do is they will go to big American companies like Boeing, big American companies like Tesla, and find points of leverage in the business relationship. You know, not approving a big purchase from Boeing or not giving Tesla some of the legal and regulatory approvals they need in their, massive EV production facility. And so I think that the Chinese have developed a pretty large, multi-tiered, sophisticated toolkit they can use to generate leverage with Washington.
One of the really interesting aspects, though, of this transition, of course, is that the Biden administration is doing so much in its final days. And if the Chinese retaliate, they're essentially going to be retaliating after the Trump administration takes office. Maybe Trump will undo some of these things. I don't know. For example, the AI diffusion rule seems to be quite controversial. But I wonder whether the Chinese are going to hold back and see what the Trump administration wants to do first. What do you think? Does that make sense?
I think that's right. And the actions the Chinese have taken just in the past week in response to a flurry of Biden administration actions. I mean, the Chinese retaliation has been surprisingly quick. I mean, literally 24, 48-hour turnaround tells me the Chinese really want to start off with the Trump administration in a new and different way. In other words, they're trying to compartmentalize what is retaliation for Biden action so they can preserve space for some kind of deal with Trump. And that's important because the Chinese are interested in a deal largely because they want time, right? They need a little bit of time to improve their macroeconomic situation, make their economy more resilient and more self-reliant. So their penchant for a deal, I don't think, is driven by a great sense of vulnerability. I don't think it's driven by naivete. I think it's just driven by the cold, hard calculation, hey, we need to buy some time, but we have no illusion we're in a long-term geopolitical and ideological competition that has economics and technology at its core.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So two things about the 2017 model that I think were effective for China, at least for a while. One was that they dealt with, of course, Trump's son-in-law and daughter, Jared and Ivanka Kushner. That option isn't available this time, but there are potential businessmen. I think people are very interested in whether Elon Musk is going to play a role. And then the other aspect, I think, of the 2017 model that was effective for China and I guess for the Trump administration, since it seemed to be what they wanted, was to have an early meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. They met in Mar-a-Lago in April, and that led to an agreement to basically cooperate on North Korea and put the bilateral trade deficit on the back burner. So do you think the Chinese are going to use this kind of approach? Do you think they're eager to have a very early meeting with Trump to set the tone and trajectory of the relationship?
It's hard to say, but if I had to bet, I would bet no. I don't think the Chinese trust Trump. They don't like his hawkish advisors, but they think they can manipulate him. So I think that they would be sort of open to a meeting, which is why they're sending Vice President Han Zheng, not Xi Jinping. They're open to a deal because, as I said, it buys them a little bit of time as their economy hopefully, I mean, from their perspective, hopefully improves. But the Chinese are also very wary of a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping because they understand who Trump is and what he's all about. They're worried about exposing Xi Jinping to risk. You know, he meets with Trump and then weeks or months later, the relationship gets a lot worse. So I don't think the Chinese are particularly anxious to do that. And as I said in the opening, I think they understand that the personal relationship, personal connection won't get you very far with Trump. So I think that they will, you know, they'll sort of explore the boundaries of a deal, but they're also preparing for a very challenging, difficult, and tough economic competition. I think it's very unlikely that Trump and Xi are going to meet early on. But the fact that they're sending an envoy indicates that they want to build a tie to the Trump administration. What they really want to know is, who is our key guy? As you said, Bonnie, it was Jared Kushner before. Who is it going to be this time around? What does Trump want? And can we use a decent understanding of Trump's goals combined with a channel directly to the president as a way to negotiate a deal?
I've been hearing from some Chinese experts that they think maybe the bilateral relationship will be the inverse of the first term. So last time it started out with like a modestly stable relationship after the presidents met in Mar-a-Lago. And then, of course, after COVID, there was a deterioration of the relationship. So some people are suggesting to me that they think maybe there will be a lot more friction and tension early on, but then would stabilize maybe in the second half of the administration, although I'm not quite sure what would facilitate that. Maybe it would be negotiating a deal or the recognition by both sides that they have hurt each other, inflicted enough pain, and they need to, for their own interest, to stabilize the relationship. But that second part of it, I'm just speculating. So do either of these patterns make sense to you?
I mean, they do. Both of them make sense. The latter pattern is certainly more likely than the former. In other words, the relationship starts out with higher friction and they find some kind of, ceasefire or negotiated solution. So if I had to bet, I would bet on that over a repeat of the 2018 pattern. But it's Trump, Bonnie, so we just have to sort of wait and see. It's totally unpredictable. And to make an obvious point, the current era of the U.S.-China relationship, because we're now firmly, clearly in an era of strategic competition, and international politics is far more complex after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's sort of more variables to play with. One of them being how committed is the Trump administration to try and reaching an end to the war in Ukraine? And do they think the Chinese can play a role? And how does that play in our in possible economic competition, economic skirmishes, and some kind of ceasefire or deal?
So let's talk a little bit about Ukraine then. Trump said on social media at one point that China can be helpful, didn't go into any detail. I don't know what his thinking is. My own sense is that Trump would rather engage, if he can, directly with Putin rather than asking Xi Jinping for a favor. But do you think there's a scenario in which Xi Jinping might take small steps to help? We have heard, for example, from Jake Sullivan about how China was helpful in mentioning in some way, communicating with Putin that he should not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and should not launch nuclear weapons into space. I think the Chinese or the Russians have denied that. But of course, there are things that Xi Jinping here could do, even if he wasn't directly communicating with Putin. He could offer providing peacekeeping troops, being a guarantor, offering to rebuild infrastructure in Ukraine, I think the Chinese would not want to be cut out. So what role does that make any sense to you? Will Xi Jinping see this as an opportunity? I remember Jiang Zemin seeing 9/11 as an opportunity, obviously very different, not really a good analogy, but the Chinese know that there are opportunities and ways, where you can improve relations with the United States at a particular juncture that I think can help stabilize and, as you said earlier, buy time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese are searching for leverage in dealing with Trump. And if Ukraine offers them a piece of leverage, they'll figure out how to use it. But as a student of Chinese statecraft, and like you, Bonnie, as somebody that has written and commented on China's policy toward Ukraine, I'm skeptical of how much the Chinese are really prepared to do. I think the Chinese will look at the Ukraine issue and they will offer some help to Trump. They probably won't do very much, and then they will claim success. Anything that is in their direct material interests, like helping to rebuild Ukraine, they will embrace. But of course, that doesn't have to do with encouraging Russia to reach a peace deal. That's about ensuring that Chinese infrastructure companies get lots of big fat contracts. So it's not really clear to me that the Chinese are going to be able or willing to really do that much. And to date, every time the US and the international community, including many of our allies and partners in Europe, have asked the Chinese to do more with Russia on Ukraine, they haven't. And so I think Beijing gets way too much credit for doing things like supposedly pressuring Putin not to use nuclear weapons. And I hear this a lot when I travel to Europe, because I frankly doubt that Xi Jinping really said very much to Putin, or that Xi Jinping's statements, even if he did said something, had much impact on Putin. The Chinese on this question of nuclear usage have barely said anything publicly. I mean, you know what the playbook is, Bonnie, right? The Chinese repeat a statement that they've said multiple times over and over. Nuclear weapons shouldn't play a major role in international politics. They get huge credit for it because we're all so desperate to see China do something. And what happens is, people, policymakers want China to do something so badly. We think it's in their interests, when in fact the Chinese may be more agnostic than we believe. And then we project that ambition onto China and give them credit for doing something when they really didn't do very much. So I'm pretty skeptical, but I think the Chinese will try to sort of make a mountain out of a molehill. They'll do a little bit. It will be in their direct interests, and they will ask to be at the center of the reconstruction effort, because that's what really matters to them: big, fat infrastructure contracts. And I think it's really going to be up to the Ukrainians, European policymakers, and American policymakers to be really judicious about how much credit China really deserves, if it plays any role at all.
I very much agree with you. I think there are many capitals where I go and talk to officials and hear that there's still a lot of hope that Xi Jinping will swoop in and tell Putin what he should and should not do. And I actually don't think that's the way that Xi Jinping communicates to Putin. I think when they meet, they focus on the issues that they actually have agreement on, and set aside or compartmentalize those that they have differences on. I have a hard time really believing that Xi Jinping warned Putin not to use nuclear weapons, although one could imagine that he may have said, just as he did to Germany's Chancellor Scholz, that China has long stood for, not using nuclear weapons, but he got a lot more credit for that than he may have actually deserved.
Yeah, very, very well said, Bonnie. I think that's yet one more of the examples where it's like Mao Zedong. He would sort of mumble something, people would interpret it as sort of, the musings of an oracle, but it wouldn't really mean very much, and it wouldn't change Chinese behavior.
Right. So let me touch on Taiwan. My own view is that Xi Jinping has not yet decided to use force against Taiwan. I think he is unlikely to do so unless and until he has very high confidence that the costs are tolerable, or if he sees his own position as threatened by not acting. So that's, a war of necessity versus a war of choice. But my view is, 2027, yes, he's instructed the PLA to be ready, but that doesn't really signal a decision to use force. I think he has low confidence in the PLA. I think that he's probably drawn lessons from Ukraine that have induced caution, not emboldened him. And my guess is that because of his concerns about the Chinese economy and maybe even social stability, and also Trump, of course, doesn't want to be entangled in a military conflict, and he knows that. So he might believe even that the Trump administration would restrain Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te if he were doing something that was really provocative. So for all of those reasons, my sense is that the likelihood of a Chinese invasion, any large-scale use of force against Taiwan, not only before 2027, but really any time in the next 4 years, is really quite low. So you agree or disagree?
I agree with your assessment of Xi Jinping's Taiwan policy, but Bonnie, you and I have long agreed, about how Xi Jinping looks at Taiwan. And I agree that the risk of a large-scale invasion or major use of force by 2027 is relatively low. The 2027 date has sort of gotten outsized importance. And the way I look at it is Xi Jinping wants the option, so he's buying the option to use force by 2027, but he has by no means made the political decision to exercise that option. And I think it's more about lighting a fire under the feet of the PLA and trying to get them to focus by using a deadline than it is about preparing for conflict. That said, I don't rule out the possibility of targeted or discrete use of force to induce caution into the U.S. or Taiwan if, this is important, if Xi Jinping is pushed there by U.S. actions, Taiwan actions, or a combination of the two. So I agree that he lacks a lot of confidence in the PLA. It's certainly not capable yet of large-scale invasion of Taiwan. But let's not forget what Jiang Zemin did in 95, 96 when the PLA was far, far, far less capable than it is today. So I think that we can't rule out the possibility if you have a bunch of, if the Trump administration decides to really embrace Taiwan in a significant way and turn it into a sort of quasi-alliance relationship. But as we've talked about previously, Bonnie, there are also people in the Trump administration like Elbridge Colby, assuming he gets confirmed, who have a much more restrained approach toward Taiwan. In other words, feels like Taiwan needs to demonstrate better that it's committed to its defense before the U.S. is going to do more. So again, it's one of these issues. It's very difficult to tell where the Trump administration is going to come at. There's multiple different voices. And if you listen to what Trump himself says, I would call him a Taiwan skeptic, right? He doesn't immediately articulate all those reasons why protecting Taiwan is in U.S. interest: credibility of security alliances, geopolitics, democracy globally, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to tell where the Trump administration is going to go on Taiwan.
So finally, Evan, maybe I just sort of ask you a big picture question that I'm concerned about, which is what's going to happen to our alliances under the Trump administration. And I'm sure you're watching. There are many countries that appear to me to be trying to stabilize and improve their own relations with China, some for economic reasons. It looks like the UK right now is doing that. I think we're going to have a transition in South Korea, a new president that will come to power that from what I understand, the South Koreans are quite eager to have Xi Jinping attend the APEC meeting there and probably will try to shore up their relationship with China after that leadership transition takes place. And China is reaching out and wooing every possible ally of the United States that they think they have the opportunity to really drive a wedge in that relationship. And the EU is really at the top of my list there. And Japan is just beginning a process after about 6 years now of improving relations with China. We've already seen the Australia relationship with China normalize. What does this all mean? Do you think that this is going to really be advantageous to China? Are we going to be here a couple of years from now and talk about how our alliances have substantially weakened? Or do you think that countries have, most of our allies have really come to believe that China poses such a serious threat to them, and in Japan's case, probably existential, that their relations with the United States will remain strong? What will Trump's policies toward our allies and China's policies towards our allies, what impact will they have as we look at the global alignment of relationships a few years from now?
Right. So in assessing the consequences for global order, global geopolitical alignment, I think it's important to look at American allies and partners, what some people call the global West. That's allies and partners in Europe and in Asia. But it's also important to look at other actors, this big group some call the global South, right? Because both will be important in different ways to this question of global order and geopolitical alignment. On the allies front, the Trump advisors, like the National Security Advisor designate, Mike Waltz, he says the right things, right? They understand that the network of alliances and partnerships is this unique strength. But of course, Trump has always notoriously been skeptical of our allies. And he always, he has long, for decades, looked at American allies as rent seekers, people that get a lot of stuff for free. So I think what you're going to see is stress in the American alliance network. You mentioned South Korea, some of our allies in Europe. I think those relationships are very naturally going to be stressed. Japan and Australia historically have done well navigating Donald Trump. So it'll be a patchwork. The Chinese obviously try to exploit it, right? I mean, just a few days ago, you had Xi Jinping on the phone with the new European Council president. And so the Chinese will try to exploit it, but they never do a terribly good job, in large part because there's so many things they do to our allies that our allies dislike. So I don't worry about a fundamental change in our alliance network and China exploiting tensions, because historically speaking, it's never really worked. What I worry more about is Trump's protectionism, unilateral initiatives that really undermine the American ability to maintain influence in the global South. Now, the global South is admittedly a big, diverse group, right? What do Saudi Arabia and Chile have in common, for example? But nonetheless, there are a group of geopolitical swing states, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Chile, and others that control technologies, control critical minerals that are going to be essential to all the big global trends going forward: digitalization, clean energy, AI, semiconductors, etc. So the real question to me is, on this issue of global alignment, how much the Chinese and Xi Jinping will be able to take advantage of uncertainty and volatility coming out of the Trump administration, right? The more unreliable and unpredictable the United States becomes, the more countries all over the world are going to hedge, but hedge in ways that don't allow us, or hedge in ways that minimize America's ability to preserve our influence and gain additional influence. Because this big group of countries, the global South, unlike during the US-Soviet Cold War, they are capable, they have agency, and we need many of them. So that's what I worry about.
So, very last question, Evan, what really worries you in the U.S.-China relationship going forward?
The U.S.-China relationship today is in a very delicate phase. I think that the U.S. and China essentially are in this process of negotiating the boundaries of their strategic competition at the same time that both sides are bulking up their economic and security tools of competition. The applicable but limited analogy is the US-Soviet competition in the 1950s. Now, of course, in the US-Soviet experience, nuclear weapons were at the forefront. That's not the case for the US-China relationship, but nuclear weapons could get there. And of course, the US and the Soviet Union had far fewer ways to communicate than we do with the Chinese. But what worries me is that we're going through this phase of negotiating the boundaries of the competition, and both sides are very much still probing and testing one another. And that's inherently dangerous, and you throw into that mix an American leader like Trump that himself is a source of uncertainty and volatility. And to me, in an environment like that, the risk of an accident, or probably more likely a strategic miscalculation in Beijing or in Washington, is exceptionally high.
Well, on that note, definitely realistic, but we'll have to closely watch how...
Sober, but not necessarily optimistic, Bonnie.
Not optimistic. But we will come back to you at some point after the Trump administration is already seated, new people have taken their positions, and we have a better idea where the relationship is going, and then we can reconnect. But thanks so much for your insights. We have been talking to Dr. Evan Medeiros, Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service and Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us, Evan.